Now, the third wave is wreaking havoc across the country, especially in the Gauteng province. There is growing criticism against government's slow pace in the vaccination program. But not everyone wants to be vaccinated. Let's zoom in now on the labor laws and what they say. Can employers force employees to vaccinate should they be unwilling? To answer this, as well as more questions, I'm joined by Mr. Tamsanqa Mila, Associate in the Employment Practice at Cliff Decker Hofmeyer. Mr. Mila, good to have you with us this afternoon. So let's clarify this. Can employers compel employees to be vaccinated?
Good afternoon, Tammy. The answer is not straightforward, and it depends on what the government has said. The president has been quite clear and emphatic since the beginning of the rollout this year that no one is forced to take the vaccination. So employers have to take heed and follow the advice of the government. And the preliminary answer for now would be that there is no compulsory requirements to be vaccinated as South Africans.
So if you could then put this into perspective for us, because NEDLAC has reportedly spoken out about a circumstance where employers can actually dismiss employees. Break this down for us.
My understanding of that is that those are currently guidelines. They have not been signed on, or they have not become part of the law. So I think it is something that will influence employers in considering whether or not to have vaccination policies and how to deal with it going forward. But my understanding is that the discussions and the guidelines or the deliberations at NEDLAC have not yet become part of either policy or regulations that must be followed by employers in South Africa.
Could you take us through some of those guidelines that have so far been tabled?
So the requirement or the purpose of those guidelines is to guide employers, specifically employers in specific industries or sectors such as the financial sector, in handling or dealing with the rollout of vaccinations, and also assisting employers in implementing specific guidelines or how those things can be done. For instance, can an employer undertake or conduct vaccinations within its premises, or do you have to have those done at a public sector or at a health like a hospital or a clinic? Or are employers now going to be role players in making sure that we get to a point where we vaccinate more people in the country and touch or be able to have a better success rate in relation to that?
Talk to us about the various stakeholders here. Who exactly has been responsible for the compilation or the drawing up of these guidelines, and at what point will they actually be open for any sort of public comment and contribution?
NEDLAC is a combination of employees and employers as well as the government. So in labor terms, it's employers and employees, labor and employees. So you would have various representatives representing different sectors. So for instance, the mining sector, the transport sector, the finance sector, as well as on the other side, the union representatives in their various organizations, whether it be the most prominent as a federation or various different unions that operate in the various sectors. So NUMSA for that particular sector, that's relevant to them, or any other union for that matter. So it's a meeting or an establishment or a particular place to have all of those various minds that have interest in the way that South African employment works, and they deliberate on the various issues.
It really is certainly still a work in progress, but we did hear Business for South Africa coming out and saying that the guidelines as they currently exist now do not actually protect the employee from being fired. Talk to us about the risk assessment then that employers need to look at in determining what the way forward would be with particular employees.
So that's a case-by-case basis that depends on the environment of the employer. So I, for instance, who works in a law firm, have a different risk assessment in comparison to someone who works underground as a miner or someone who works in the retail space. And I think that to the extent that an employer can accommodate its employees without having to force employees to take on a vaccine, the employers must rather go on that particular route. For instance, I work from home. My background is my kitchen, unfortunately. But I think the considerations of an employer like mine versus the considerations of an employer who has to be concerned about the health and safety of their employees, their proximity to members of the public, and how much of interactions in relation to COVID that they can control, quote unquote, would have to be one of the considerations in making the risk assessment.
You know, this is an absolute minefield because it can open employers up to a lot of litigation as far as unfair dismissals should the employee feel that they've been unfairly treated. If they have, for example, been classified as high risk and they deem that they are not, and that whatever measures were put in place to protect the other workers have not been put in place. How is this going to be dealt with, do you believe, from a legal perspective? What impact is this going to have?
So it would depend on the reason the employer is given to dismiss the employee. If the reason is that the employee does not want to take a vaccine, and the government on the other hand has said it is not necessary for employees to take vaccines, I think the law and the direction from the government would in that particular case prevail. If it's an issue about a reasonable instruction, and we'd have to weigh that against the feeling or the mood of the government in relation to what must happen, or if vaccines are mandatory or not, it would have to also look at what measures the employer themselves have taken to ensure that the employee can participate or can work or provide their services with limited interruptions. So for instance, in my particular case, I work from home, and you would have to weigh the instruction of me being vaccinated to the threat or the risk of me spreading. Should I get the virus, the particular virus in the workplace? So those are the considerations that, from a labor law perspective, and if you were to take it, for instance, to the CCMA, challenging the fairness of that dismissal, those are the considerations in my mind any commissioner who's charged to deal with that particular matter would consider.
If, for example, an employee is deemed to be high risk, they choose, for example, not to take the vaccination, but there are alternate ways that they can use in order to fulfill their jobs, like working from home, for example. Is there going to be enough flexibility to explore those type of options?
So accommodation in the employment law aspect is something that's already part of our law, although for different reasons. So for instance, if an employee is sick and they cannot ordinarily produce or come to the office in the manner that they usually do bar for the sickness, the employer is required to accommodate. So similarly, although being a high-risk employee is not the same as being sick, in my mind, I think that the employers would be encouraged to accommodate those employees. So for instance, to the extent that you can do your job at home, I would encourage employers to accommodate those particular employees if they really genuinely feel, for whatever reason that they provide to the employer, depending on the reason, of course, that they don't want to take the vaccination or to be vaccinated, then I would say that they'd be accommodated by the employer to ensure that they don't lose their job, and the employer also gets benefit from the employee because we are paid to tender services to our employer.
What happens, Mr. Mila, in the instance that an employer who is sick, who's unwell, goes to work, and it turns out that they have then also infected their colleagues? How does that scenario play out?
The regulations by the government give guidance to the general population about that. Everyone must disclose that they were infected with the virus, and if they do disclose that they were infected with the virus, then the employer would have to advise those who are in contact with that particular person and then the guidelines or the regulations issued by the government from time to time about the requirement to self-isolate, the requirement not to report to work, or the requirement to test if you have been infected, to just check and confirm if you actually are COVID positive or not, would then come into play. So those ordinary requirements that have been published by the government would also come into play.
So I'm letting you go in just a moment, but if somebody knows that they're positive or they're waiting for their test results and yet they still go out and in turn infect others, if you've been infected in such a scenario, is there any sort of recourse for you?
My understanding is that there is no recourse. I think the part, which is what the government has been saying, that we need to also take our own responsibility, or be responsible for our own selves and the rest of the people in the country. I'm not sure if you can say that you want to take action now against Tamsanqa because he infected you and he knew that he was either COVID positive or was awaiting results. I'm not sure that we can sue each other for negligent conduct across the country.
Mr. Tamsanqa Mila, thank you very much for your insights today. Certainly a topic that's close to everybody's hearts at this time. He is an associate in the employment practice at Cliff Decker Hofmeyr.